There is a thing known to every honest music copyist and to almost no one else, that a song will answer, in the end, to the hand that made it, and to no other. You may engrave any name you please upon a title page and have the whole town believe it. None of it will teach a stranger's hand to have made the crossings out, for a finished song is only the last of 100 that were tried and struck out to reach it, and the striking out is where the maker lives. A copyist may counterfeit a fair copy, note for note, until no eye can part them, but no copyist alive can counterfeit the false starts, the discarded turnings, the phrase written and crossed and written again a better way, because those are not the music. They are the mind that was making it, and a mind cannot be forged after the fact. And the old benchmen of the trade say a harder thing still, that a well-dressed lie about who made a thing will pass with every soul who wishes to believe it or fears to doubt it, which is to say, with nearly everyone alive, save only the one plain person who happens to know what the true note was, because she is the one who found it. A tuning fork struck true gives one note and one only. It does not flatter for the fashionable, and keeps its pitch when every voice in the choir has gone comfortably astray, and is a little hated for it, as an honest thing always is by a room that has agreed to be wrong. And so the whole art of undoing a clever lie about the making of a thing is not genius at all. It is only patience, and a true ear, and the drafts kept where no fire has reached them, and one unregarded soul that nobody thinks to watch, keeping the music of a house that has long forgotten she keeps anything at all. Esther Lowell had been at Wyndholme Hall some years, and in all that time had contrived, with a good deal of care, to be very nearly invisible. She was 29 when the story finds her, a slight, plain, quiet woman with a still, level way of looking at things, brown hair bound back simply under a plain cap, and the composed, unhurried hands of a person raised to handle the delicate and the borrowed, without ever presuming to own one. She was the only daughter of Thomas Lowell, parish organist and music master of the little town of Nethercot, a gentle, exact, unlucky man, who understood the inside of a piece of music better than any man in 3 counties, and died no richer for it. He had taught singing at 1 shilling the quarter, tuned the gentry's instruments for less than they paid their grooms, and copied out parts by candle for the choir he trained, and in 55 years had never once been out of the reach of want, and Esther had grown up at his elbow in the organ loft. Before she was 12 she had his ear, could name a note struck in another room, could hear the one wrong voice in a full choir the way you hear your own name across a crowd. She had his hand, too. She could set a fair copy so clean the Nethercot choir sang from her sheets and thought them printed. And she had the whole quiet undertrade of music, how a hand betrays itself, how an ink browns with its years, how a copy differs from an original, and an original from the thing a composer first scrawled in the heat of making it. Above all she had his creed, which he had given her at the loft bench, with a plain steel tuning fork in his hand, striking it on his knee so the one pure note sang out over the cold, empty church. Hear that, Esther, that is A. And it will be A in this church when you and I are dust. It does not care that the squire wants it sharper to suit some singer's voice, nor that the fashion this year is to sing a little high. It keeps its one note and takes no one's part, and every honest thing in music is built upward from it. Build on the note that is true, and not on the note that pleases. The pleasing note will fail you in the end, and the true one never will. The organ loft died with him. He was found one winter morning slumped over the keys, gone gently between one breath and the next in the middle of a voluntary, and it killed, along with him, the only home Esther had. There was nothing to inherit but debts. A box of copied parts nobody would buy, and the plain steel tuning fork, which she kept and keeps still. She went out, as portionless gentlewomen do, to be a companion, and through the recommendation of a clergyman's wife who had liked her father's choir, she was taken at Wyndholme Hall as companion and reader to the Dowager Duchess of Wyndholme, a great, cold, exacting old personage of unquestioned county consequence, who wanted her letters read and her long evenings filled, and found, to her surprise, that the plain reader had a further use. For Wyndholme was a house of music, or had been. There were instruments in half its rooms, and nobody left who could keep any of it. And it was discovered, almost by accident, that the quiet reader with the organist's hands could tune the neglected pianofortes better than the man they sent from town, set a torn part to rights in an evening, and play the old airs when the dowager could not sleep, softly, for hours, asking nothing. So Esther Lowell stayed on as the keeper of Wyndholme's music, which was no office known to the peerage and carried no dignity whatever, and went about the great silent house with her father's tuning fork in her workbox, tuning and copying and mending, and the household, when it thought of her at all, thought of her as it thought of the pianofortes, a useful, silent, unregarded thing that lived in the good rooms and was noticed only when it went wrong. And in her own hours, the late hours after the dowager slept, the one part of her life that was her own, Esther Lowell did the thing she had never told a living soul at Wyndholme that she did. She composed. It had come on her young and never left her. The airs arrived in her head unasked, whole phrases of them, and would not be quiet until she had caught them on paper. And over the years, in her small high room with one candle, she had made a cycle of them, a set of airs that were the whole diary of her heart, since she kept no other. Her father's death was in them, and the cold beauty of the winters, and a grief or two she never named, all of it turned into music, because music was the only country in which a portionless companion was rich. She wrote them out in two kinds. There were the foul copies, the working drafts in her own quick hand, dated in the corner as her father had taught her to date everything, and covered over with the wreckage of composing, bars struck through, a modulation tried and abandoned, a phrase written 3 ways with 2 crossed out, the whole visible labor of a thing being made. And there were the fair copies, clean and printed-looking, that she made of the ones she was satisfied with. She never dreamed of a wider audience than her own candle, and half believed a companion who wrote music was a slightly absurd thing. People taught by the world that they are worth nothing learn to say it first themselves, to get the sting out of it. She had, in all her years at Wyndholme, exactly one friend, the one soul in that house nobody would have predicted for her, the Duke's younger sister, Lady Rosamund Wyndholme. Lady Rosamund was everything Esther was not. Bright, warm, quick, and lovely, adored by the whole county, and she was, besides, genuinely musical in the way of a gifted amateur. She played with feeling and no discipline, and had not the least idea how music was made. She had found Esther out early, coming down one sleepless night to the shut music room and hearing the companion playing something in the dark that she did not know. She had listened to the end and said, "I have never heard that in my life. What is it?" And Esther, caught, said it was nothing, an old thing half remembered, and Lady Rosamund, who for all her warmth was nobody's fool, sat down beside her and said, "Esther Lowell, you made that. Do not you dare tell me you did not, for I saw your face." And that was the beginning of the one equal friendship of Esther's grown life. Lady Rosamund could not be kept from the airs. She learned them off Esther's fair copies, every one, and played them better than Esther did. She called them, always, your airs, when the two of them were alone. But she was a duke's sister and Esther a paid companion, and it never once occurred to the generous, thoughtless young lady to announce to the drawing-room that the airs everyone begged her to play were her companion's work, and not her own. Why would it? Nobody asked. When a duke's musical sister plays a lovely unknown air with tears standing in her eyes, a drawing-room does not inquire into its provenance, it assumes. And so, across 2 happy years, without one word of untruth ever spoken, the whole of Wyndholme and half the county came to know Esther Lowell's airs as Lady Rosamund's. And the woman who had made them turned the pages and said nothing, because it was happiness enough in those years to hear the thing she had made out of loneliness played by the one person who loved her, into a room full of people who loved that person. It was the nearest to being seen that Esther Lowell had ever come. She did not know it was borrowed. There was one other person who knew the airs were Esther's, and he was the man who would in time destroy her for it, Mr. Aubrey Merrick. Merrick was a connection of the family at some remove, and that not uncommon figure of the age, a gentleman of good birth, small fortune, and large fashionable talent, who had made himself indispensable to the great as a man of taste. He advised on pictures, arranged the music at the best houses, composed pretty songs of his own that were sung for a season, and lived agreeably on the borders of other people's wealth by being charming and clever, and never quite paid for. He had been engaged in Lady Rosamund's youth as her music master, and continued after as her musical companion, and it was through her that he came one afternoon upon the Lowell airs, heard the farewell, went very still, and said, "Where did you get that?" In a voice Esther had not liked. He had known at once what it was worth. Men who live by taste can price a thing in a breath. He had tried, in his smooth way, to get the airs from her, offered to see them properly brought out, with his own name upon them as the reviser who had found and formed a raw talent, and Esther, who did not trust him the length of the room, had quietly declined and given him nothing. He had not forgiven it. A man like Merrick does not forgive, being refused a thing he has already, in his own mind, spent. But there was nothing to be done while Rosamund lived, and the airs were the private pleasure of 2 women in a shut room, and so Mr. Merrick had smiled, and waited, and priced the thing, and bided. Then, in the hard winter of the year 1816, a fever went through the county, and Lady Rosamund Wyndholme, 25 and full of life, took it, and in 11 days was dead. It broke the house. It very nearly broke the Duke. Alaric, Duke of Wyndholme, was 36, and had been before that winter a reserved but not a cold man, exacting, private, dutiful, with a dry wit kept for the few he trusted. He had made of his adored, headlong sister the one uncomplicated love of his careful life. He had nursed her himself through the 11 days, against every remonstrance, and been holding her hand at the end, and the man who came out of that sick room was not the man who had gone in. He shut. The wit went, and the dryness stayed and hardened, and he could not, from that winter, bear music. It was the particular cruelty of his grief that the thing most bound up with Rosamund, her playing. The sound of her about the house was the thing he could least endure. The music room was shut by his order, the pianoforte silenced, and for a year the great musical house of Wyndholme made no sound at all, because its master could not walk past an open instrument without hearing his sister at it and having to stop in the passage with his hand against the wall. Esther grieved too, silently, for the one friend she had had in the world, and wrote no airs that year. The candle in the high room stood dark. And she told no one of the second grief, that her heirs had gone into the ground with Rosamund wearing another's name, and that she found she scarcely minded, So far under the plain grief for her friend did the smaller grief for the music lie. And then, when the year of silence was near out, Mr. Aubrey Merrick made his move. And it was a masterpiece of its wicked kind, because it wore the whole face of love. He came to the Duke gently, as a fellow mourner, and said he could not bear so much beauty should be lost. That Lady Rosamund, as his grace perhaps did not fully know, had been no mere player but a composer of rare gift, who had left behind a whole cycle of airs of extraordinary loveliness. That he, Merrick, as her old master, had gathered her music after her death and found there a treasure, and that the truest memorial to her, better than any marble, would be to bring out her airs to the world, engraved and bound, so that wherever they were sung her memory should live. He put it beautifully. He was a man who could put anything beautifully. And to the Duke, drowning in a grief that had nowhere to go, it came like water in a desert. Here was a way to keep her, to turn the unbearable silence back into her own sound and call it honor instead of agony. He seized on it with the whole force of his mourning, and Mr. Merrick, who had proposed to spend the Duke's grief and the Duke's gold on the making of Mr. Merrick's own reputation, bowed his head modestly and undertook the sacred trust. What Merrick actually possessed, of course, was not a music case full of Lady Rosamund's compositions. It was the copies Rosamund had made or been given of Esther's airs, her practice copies, some in her own hand, and one intermediate copy in Esther's own hand of the great air, the Farewell, that Esther had written out for Rosamund 2 years before, and that had drifted, among the borrowings of 2 friends, into Merrick's keeping and never been returned. That was his whole stock, and it was enough. He knew the airs were Esther's. He knew there existed, somewhere in the servants' quarters, a plain companion who could ruin the beautiful scheme with a word, and he laid his plans accordingly, for he was not a rash man. He would bring out the edition fast and grandly and under the full weight of the family's authority, so that by the time any objection could be raised, the thing would be a monument no one would dare deface, and the objector would look, of necessity, like a jackal at a grave. He set the airs to be engraved. He wrote a memorial preface, a thing of real beauty, everyone agreed, all about the brief bright life and the hidden genius, with himself figuring throughout as the devoted master who had rescued the gift from oblivion, and he named the collection, in gilt upon its title page, The Posthumous Airs of the Late Lady Rosamund Wyndholme, collected, edited, and reverently presented by A. Merrick Esq. It came out in the spring. And it was a triumph beyond even Merrick's hopes. There is nothing the fashionable world loves like a lovely lost young lady and a beautiful sad tune, and here were both, wrapped in a duke's grief and a man of taste's exquisite preface, and the airs themselves were undeniably lovely, which no puffery can manufacture, and which carried the edition into every drawing-room in the kingdom on its own true merit. Great ladies wept over the Farewell at their pianofortes. It was sung and copied and sung again, and praised by people whose praise made reputations, and Mr. Merrick, its discoverer and editor, found himself suddenly a person of consequence, invited everywhere, deferred to, the man who had given the age its loveliest posthumous voice. And the Duke of Wyndholme, hearing his sister's name spoken with tenderness and awe in rooms where he had feared it would dreadfully stop being spoken at all, felt the one easing of his grief he had known since the sick room, and was grateful, grateful to the heirs, and grateful, above all and most dangerously, to the good, devoted Mr. Merrick, who had wrought this miracle of remembrance and asked, it seemed, nothing for himself but the privilege of serving the memory of a lady they had both loved. The Duke's gratitude to Merrick became, that spring, one of the fixed facts of Wyndholme, as solid as the house. It is worth marking, because everything that followed had to break itself against it. Esther Lowell watched all this from her place and said nothing, for longer than you might think a person could bear. A life of being worth nothing teaches you to expect nothing, and to distrust your own claims first of all. And there was Rosamund. That was the thing that held her tongue past the point she could afterward forgive in herself, that to claim the heirs was, or seemed, to attack Rosamund, to stand up and say that the friend the world was weeping over had not, after all, made the music it wept for, and Esther could not do it. Rosamund had never lied. Rosamund had only played and been assumed. The fault was not hers. And Esther would sooner have cut out her own tongue than let the county turn from weeping over Rosamund to naming her a fraud. So she was silent, and told herself the heirs had been Rosamund's gift as much as hers, since Rosamund had loved them best, and that nothing so small as who had made a tune could matter beside a friend in the ground. And she almost made it hold. What broke it was Merrick's greed, which was larger than his caution. The first edition's success went to his head, as success does, and he wanted a second volume, more heirs, to keep the golden thing turning. And for that he needed more of Esther's music than he had, and he began, that summer, to come about Wyndholme again, and go through what was left of Lady Rosamund's papers. And Esther learned from Rosamund's old maid Alice, who came to her white-faced, that Mr. Merrick had been asking after any music of her ladyship's the servants might have kept, and, worse, that he had been heard to say he had hopes of the finest thing of all, the last heir, the one her ladyship never quite finished. And Esther Lowell went cold in the passage, hearing it, for she knew exactly what the last heir was. It was the 13th, the true last of the cycle, the one she had made after her father died and shown to no soul, not even Rosamund, the one heir wholly and only hers, of which no copy existed anywhere but in her own locked box, that Rosamund had never played because she had never seen it. And Merrick, having caught perhaps some half word of it from Rosamund in life, meant now to hunt it down and print it too, as her ladyship's crowning unfinished masterpiece, reverently completed by A. Merrick-esque, he meant to take the last thing. He meant to take her father's heir, made out of the deepest grief she had, and put a dead lady's name and his own upon it, and sell it to the town. And something in Esther Lowell that a lifetime of worth nothing had never quite killed stood up at last and said, "No, not that one." She went about it, even then, as gently as it could be gone about, because she was Thomas Lowell's daughter and did not know how to be otherwise. And because she still wished above all to shield Rosamund, she did not go to the county. She went privately, hat in hand, to the two people she thought had the right to hear it first, to Mr. Merrick himself, and then, when that failed as it was always going to fail, to the Duke. To Merrick she said only, quietly, that she believed he knew as well as she did whose the heirs truly were, and that she would not see the last of them made public in another's name, that she asked nothing about the heirs already printed, would raise no clamor, would let Lady Rosamund's memory stand exactly as it stood, if only he would let the 13th alone. It was, she thought, a fair and merciful offer. It cost him only a greed he had no right to. Merrick heard her out with a small, cold smile, and she understood before he spoke that she had made a bad mistake, had shown a dangerous man exactly where she was dangerous, and how little she meant to defend herself, which to a man like Merrick is not mercy but weakness, and weakness is an opportunity. "My dear Miss Lowell," he said pleasantly, "you have been overwrought since her ladyship's death. Grief takes women oddly. Let me give you some advice, as a friend. Say this to no one else, to no one at all. For if you do, I promise you it will not be believed, and it will not be forgiven, and you will find the world has a very short way with an obscure dependent who tries to climb to notice over the grave of her betters. And he bowed, and left her, and went that same week to do the thing she should have known he would, to go to the Duke first, and poison the ground before she could stand on it. For Merrick understood the Duke's grief the way Esther understood a movement, knew its every part, and exactly where to press. He went to Alaric grave and troubled, a man forced to a painful duty, and said it grieved him beyond measure to bring his grace such a thing. But he could not in conscience keep it back, that the Dowager's companion, Miss Lowell, that quiet creature his grace had scarcely noticed, had become unsettled in her mind since Lady Rosamund's death, and begun to make a painful and extraordinary claim. That she was asserting the memorial heirs to be in fact her own, stolen from her by the family, that it was of course a pitiable fantasy, the kind that seizes sometimes upon lonely women who have lived too long in the shadow of the great and come to imagine their master's glories their own, but that it had its dangerous side. For if such a tale got abroad, it might cast a shadow, however unjust, upon her dear ladyship's memory, and that his grace should be warned, and the woman gently but firmly checked, before her fancy did the memory of the sister he mourned a public injury. It was beautifully done. It was, once again, precisely the truth turned inside out, which is always the strongest lie, and it armed the Duke with the one weapon that would make him proof against anything Esther could say, for it told him in advance that she would come with exactly the true story, and taught him to hear the true story as the raving of a disordered mind, and it wrapped the whole in the thing the Duke could not think past, the protection of Rosamund's memory. To disbelieve Merrick was now, in the Duke's wrung heart, to expose his dead sister to slander. Merrick had made the truth itself an attack on Rosamund. There is no crueler trap to set for a grieving man, and no surer, so that when Esther Lowell, some days later, gathered the whole of her small courage and stood in the Duke's study, a long, cold room where his sister's silenced world pressed in from every wall, and told him, plainly and quietly, that the memorial heirs were her own composition, made over years in her own hours, and that she had proof of it, and wished only to be believed, and to keep the last of them from the same fate she was speaking into ground salted against her a week before, and never had a chance. She saw a terrible hope leap up in his face and be crushed. For one instant, hearing her steady, particular account, some part of the Duke had wondered. And then Merrick's inoculation took, and the wondering closed over into a cold and pitying anger. The anger of a man warned that this pathetic thing was coming, who now sees it arrive on schedule and dare bring its madness into his sister's own house. He did not rage. The rage of such men is quiet, and worse. He said he had been told to expect this, that he had made every allowance for her situation and long service, and the disorder grief could work upon a solitary mind, and would make one more, and not turn her from the house that night. He said she would never, so long as she drew breath, repeat this thing to any living soul, that if one shadow fell across his sister's name from this squalid fantasy, he would know its source, and she would learn what the anger of his house could do to a friendless woman. And then he said the thing she carried longest, because he said it not in fury but in a weary contempt, looking at her as at something that had disappointed him. I had thought you at least were what you seemed. I see I was wrong to think about you at all. Get out of my sight, and be grateful I do not think you worth the ruining. And Esther Lowell, with her proof still folded and untouched in her hand, because you cannot make a drowning man examine a document, curtsied, and went out, and did not weep until she was 3 floors up in the dark of her own room, and then only a little, being long out of the habit of expecting better. The Dowager finished it. The old lady had loved her granddaughter with the fierce possessive love of the very old for the young, and had swallowed Merrick's tale whole, because he told it well, and because she wished with her whole heart to. And to her the companion's claim was not merely false, but obscene. A low creature she had fed and housed, reaching up out of the servants' hall to snatch at the dead darling's crown. She had Esther brought before her the next morning, and did what the Duke had been too grief-sick to do, cast her off, formally, coldly, and entirely. Miss Lowell was dismissed the Dowager's service, and would be gone from Wyndholme by the week's end. She would be given no character, no letter of any kind, for how, said the Dowager, her voice like a closing door, could she in conscience recommend to any respectable household a woman capable of this? And she might think herself fortunate to be let go quietly instead of exposed. Esther heard it out, with her hands folded and her face still, because she had learned very young that when the great have decided to be unjust, the only dignity left to the small is not to writhe, and she said, at the end only, "Very well, Your Grace. I am sorry to have grieved you. That was never my wish. I will be gone as you say." And she went up to pack her box, and the great house of Wyndholme was rid of the one person in it who had ever made a note of music worth remembering, and did not know it, and would not have believed it if it had been shouted from the roof. That night, her last but one at Wyndholme, her box half packed, her savings dreadfully few, no character and no place, and nowhere in the world to go. Esther Lowell sat through the worst hour of her life. She sat on the floor of her stripped little room with one candle and, spread before her, the whole of it, her foul copies, the working drafts of every air, dated and crossed and mended in her own hand, her few fair copies, and, wrapped separately, the 13th, the last heir, her father's heir, that no one living but she had ever seen. And 4 feet away in the grate, a fire burned bright and close and hungry. And Esther Lowell was tempted, that night, as she had never been tempted to anything in her honest life, to burn them. Every reason she had was for the fire. If she burned the drafts, there was an end of the danger to Rosamund forever. No proof could ever surface. The memorial would stand clean. Her friend would keep her borrowed crown untroubled, and Esther would have kept faith in the only way now left with the one soul who had ever loved her. If she burned them, she spared herself the one future she could clearly see, a friendless woman with a mad tale and a fistful of papers, going from town to town trying to make anybody believe that a duke and a celebrated gentleman had between them stolen a dead lady's music from a nobody. A story so exactly the shape of a lunatic's grievance that she would be pitied at best and locked up at worst, and end in the very madness they had already agreed to see in her. Burn them, and be safe, and be kind to the dead, and have peace. It was all there in the fire, the whole sensible, merciful, cowardly case, and she made herself look at it entire and not pretend to be above it, because her father had taught her that you do not get to choose only the easy half of a truth. She was not above it. She sat a long time with the drafts in her lap and her whole ruined future in the scale, and she very nearly did it. And then, because she was her father's daughter before she was anything else, she took the plain steel tuning fork out of her workbox, the one his hand had worn smooth, and struck it soft against her knee, and listened to the one true note sing out, and slowly die. Build on the note that is true, and not on the note that pleases. And she understood, sitting there, that the fire was the pleasing note. It was comfort and safety and an easy kind of loyalty, and it was a lie. For it was no true kindness to Rosamund to burn the proof. Rosamund had never wanted the heirs, had called them your heirs with love. The only thing the fire would protect was the theft and the thief and the great men's peace, and it would do it by putting the true note out of the world forever. He had left her exactly two things, the steel fork and the true note, and if she burned the drafts, she threw away the second to keep the first, and kept a fork that could no longer be built on. She could be safe, or she could be true, and she could not, that night, be both. And so Esther Lowell did not burn the drafts. She wrapped them instead, foul copies and fair, and the 13th together, in oiled silk against the damp, and packed them at the very bottom of her box under her few poor clothes. And she blew out the candle and sat in the dark until the birds began, keeping. Though it might never be heard by any soul on earth, the one true note there was. And in the morning she thanked the white-faced Alice who cried, and went out of the great house of Wyndholme forever, carrying at the bottom of her box the thing that would, in a year and a way she could not then have dreamed, undo 3 proud people and give her back her name. She went to Marchbourne, the county town, because it was near and cheap and she had to go somewhere, and took a small clean lodging over a chandler's, and set about the humbling, patient work of keeping alive. A woman with no character cannot be a companion. That door was shut behind her for good, and she did not waste breath grieving it. But she had a trade, the real one under the companion's gray gown. And Marchbourne was a town with music in it, and Esther Lowell went quietly to work as what her father had been, a copyist and tuner and teacher of music, taking whatever came. She copied parts, tuned tradesmen's pianofortes, and gave lessons at a shilling, then 18pence, then as her quality got about, at a modest fee that kept her in coals and candles with a very little over. It was a poor, laborious life, and she made it a decent one, because decency was a thing she could still control when nothing else obeyed her. And slowly the honest tradespeople came to value the quiet gray Miss Lowell, who kept her word and knew her business, without one of them ever dreaming that the heirs murdered at their pianofortes on a Tuesday were their own copyists' stolen work. For that was the daily private cruelty of her year in Marchbourne. Met as she met most things, in silence her heirs were everywhere. The farewell was the great tune of that whole year. It was sung at the assemblies, played in the circulating library, whistled in the street. Pupils came to her, to be taught to play Lady Rosamund's beautiful air. And she taught them, note by note. Her own grief for her own father, said nothing, took her 18pence, and went home to her cold room and did not, most nights, allow herself to mind. She had made her choice in the firelight, and she kept it in the daylight, which is the harder half of any choosing. She thought that whole year that she had simply lost, that the truth would live at the bottom of her box, unbelieved, till she died, and she found she could bear even that, so long as it was the truth that went into the ground and not the lie into the world past her own hands helping. But the man she chiefly copied for was the making of everything, though neither of them knew it for months. His name was Elias Frome, and he kept the music shop in the market square, sold instruments and sheet music, and in a back room smelling of ink and metal engraved and printed music himself, plates bitten and pulled by his own hands, for he had been an engraver in town before his chest drove him to the country air. He was a spare, dry, sharp-eyed old man of 60-odd, close-mouthed and proud of his trade, who had taken Esther on because her hand was the cleanest and truest he had seen since London. And it was Frome who first, without in the least meaning to put his finger on the crack in the whole beautiful lie. He had bought in a stock of the famous Memorial Edition to sell. Every music seller in England was selling it. And one slow afternoon, with Esther copying at the end of his counter, he had it open and was frowning over the great air, the farewell, and said half to himself, in the way of a craftsman grumbling at another's work, "Now that's a queer thing in a fine edition. There's a bar here no maker with an ear would ever have left so. Listen." And he picked it out, one finger, on the shop pianoforte, the famous modulation. The passage the whole town wept over, and said, "Hear that note against the bass? A hard thing, a thing you'd swear was a fault. It comes right in the next bar. But you're meant to sit a heartbeat in the wrongness first, and it's bold, mortal bold, the boldest thing in the piece. Whoever set this let it stand, and yet it don't sit right even so. To my ear, it's as if the boldness were an accident and not a knowing, as if whoever wrote it out hadn't rightly understood what they'd got. There's a hand in this that made a lovely thing, and a hand that copied it not understanding it, and they aren't the same hand, and it troubles me." And he turned the page and forgot it, and Esther Lowell sat very still, with her pen stopped in the air, because she alone in the world knew exactly what old Frome's good ear had caught, and that it was the thread which, pulled, would unpick the whole. For she remembered that bar. She remembered it precisely, because it had cost her more labor than any bar she had ever written. In her first draft of the farewell, she could see the page, dated 4 years gone, safe at the bottom of her box. She had written that passage plain and smooth and correct, and hated it, because it was correct and dead, and she had crossed it out, tried it 3 ways, and at last, in a later draft, struck the bold, true dissonance she wanted, the hard note that sits a heartbeat in the wrong before it comes right, which was the whole daring of the air. But there had been an in-between, an intermediate copy, made after she had found the boldness, but before she had perfected how it was written down, in which the bold note stood, but stood clumsily, not yet quite understood even by herself, so that on the page it looked half a daring and half a mistake. And that intermediate copy, neither her rough first nor her clean final, was the single copy of the farewell that had ever left her hands, the one she had written out for Rosamund, that had drifted, unreturned, into Mr. Merrick's keeping. And Merrick, setting the edition with no original and no final and no understanding, had engraved that awkward middle version exactly as it stood, clumsiness and all, because it was all he had, and he could not tell the clumsiness from the daring, had printed, for the whole weeping world, her discarded intermediate draft, complete with the very flaw that proved it a way station and not a destination. The edition did not descend from any composition of Lady Rosamund's. It descended, note for note including the telltale awkwardness, from one particular rough copy in Esther Lowell's own hand, whose earlier and later states she alone possessed and could lay in a row to show the thing growing. And Esther, at that counter, understood for the first time since the firelit night that the truth at the bottom of her box was not only a private note to be kept for its own sake and taken into the ground. It was proof a stranger could check and be forced, however unwilling, to credit, not her word against a gentleman's, but a thing itself, laid where any honest ear could test it. Her father's whole method rose up in her: never ask a man to believe your word where you can put the thing itself into his hand. She did not act on it rashly. She built her case as her father would have built it, patiently and in order, over the quiet weeks. She laid out, in her own room, the 3 states of the farewell: first draft, smooth and dated and struck through; intermediate, the awkward bold version the printed edition exactly copied; final, clean and perfected, and saw that they made, in a row, an unanswerable thing, the visible growth of a composition, dated across 2 years, ending in a form the edition did not use and passing through a form the edition copied slavishly, flaw and all. No forger makes a rough draft worse than the finished thing and then a middle draft awkwarder than either. Forgery runs the other way. Toward the polished, only true composition leaves this litter of trying behind it. And then she took out the 13th, the private one, and looked at it a long while, complete, in her hand, dated the winter of her father's death, existing in no other copy anywhere in the world, the one air that was proof all by itself, because a woman who could produce, finished and dated in her own hand, an unknown 13th air in the identical voice as the famous 12, was either their composer or a miracle. She had the case complete. And it was then, only then, that she went to old Frome and showed him the 3 states of the farewell laid in their row, and the old engraver picked them out one after another on his pianoforte, the first and the middle and the last, and heard the thing grow under his own hands, and went rather pale, and said, "God help us, Miss Lowell. It's yours. Every note of it's yours, and I can prove the plate was pulled off this middle sheet or one just like it, for I know the man's work." And then, being an honest man and a shrewd one, he gave her the hard warning, "And it'll near kill you to prove it, for it may not be provable at all to them. You've a case to satisfy any man that knows the trade, but a duke, and a fine gentleman with the whole town at his back, and an old lady with her heart in a grave, your papers won't be papers to them. They'll be an insult. Your true note'll be spite, and your own poor voice won't carry 3 feet against that gentleman's smile. If you go at this, you go where the thing can be tested and not just talked at, and get it before His Grace himself in a way he cannot look away from, not your word, the thing, the music, that he can no more argue with than he could your fork there. Let the airs answer. Your breath won't, only the airs." And there, for a while, the matter stuck, because there was no way for a dismissed companion in a chandler's garret to compel a grieving duke to sit and listen to a pianoforte, and Esther, though her case was made, might have gone to her grave with it untried, if the last strand had not been pulled from the other end, by the Duke himself, and by the one thing grief had not spoiled in him, his exactness. For there was a wrongness in his sister's memorial he could not, across that whole year, put down. It was the 13th air. Merrick, overreaching, had let fall to the Duke, as to the servants, that there existed a final air, the last and finest, that Lady Rosamund had left unfinished, to prepare the ground for completing and printing it himself in the 2nd volume. But he could not produce it. It was Esther's, at the bottom of her box in Marchbourne, and he had never had a note of it. And so the perfect monument stood, on the word of its own editor, missing its crown, and the Duke could not bear it. He pressed Merrick through the autumn. Merrick put him off with promises and beautiful excuses, and the more he put off, the more the Duke's precise, unhappy mind worried at the gap, until the missing air had become, in the fixed way of a grief that has fastened on a detail, the one thing left in the world that Alaric of Wyndholme wanted, to have his sister's music whole. And in pursuit of it, sending at last past the evasive Merrick, having Rosamund's old maid Alice questioned kindly, the Duke came upon the buried fact that changed everything, that there had been in Lady Rosamund's life a companion she was close with, the plain Miss Lowell his grandmother had turned off, who, Alice said, going white but staunch in the telling, used to play the last air. The best one, the one that was never in the book, that her ladyship loved most and said was too dear to write out, and that Miss Lowell was living now in Marchbourne, teaching music for her bread. The Duke did not, even then, suspect the truth. Grief in Merrick's inoculation held too strong. He supposed only that the dismissed companion, having been intimate with Rosamund and musical herself, might have learned the last air by ear before his sister died, and might be got for a fee to play it or set it down, so that the monument could be completed. He very nearly deputed the errand to a servant, but the thing was too near his heart, and there was besides in the exact man a small hard splinter he did not examine. A memory of a gray woman standing very steady in his study, saying particular sane things in a particular sane voice, that did not, when he was honest, sit easily with the raving lunatic Merrick had described. So he wrote, himself, a short, cold civil note requiring her attendance at Wyndholme on a day near the turn of the year, upon a matter concerning the late Lady Rosamund's music. And the day he named, whether by design or by that dark accuracy with which such things arrange themselves, was the anniversary of Rosamund's death, on which the family and a few near friends were to gather in the music-room, among her silent instruments, to hear the memorial airs played and honor her. And to that gathering before the whole seated house, the summons brought Esther Lowell back. She came. Of course she came. It was the thing she had prayed for without daring to hope it, to be got by any means into a room where the music could be made to answer for her, though she went, in fact, on the carrier's cart, in her plain gray gown, her draughts wrapped in oiled silk and a plain wooden box on her lap, and her father's tuning fork in her pocket. Old Frome had wanted to come, and she would not let him risk his trade, but he had done the one thing that mattered. In the weeks before, had made sworn and dated copies of her 3 states of the farewell, and written out over his own name and seal, as a master engraver of 30 years, his professional certificate that the printed edition was set from a copy in the state of the middle sheet, and lodged the whole with a Marchbourne solicitor, where no fire and no duke could reach it, so that whatever befell Esther in the great house, the truth was now beyond burning, as it had not been the night she chose not to burn it. She went, that is, not as she had gone the first time, a friendless woman with a naked tale, but with the thing itself, provable, in her hand. And one clear principle to steer by: do not ask them to believe you. Make them examine the thing, and let it do what your word cannot. The music-room of Wyndholme, thrown open that evening for the first time since Rosamund died, was full of the low candle-lit murmur of a company come to mourn, the Dowager enthroned in dark silks by the fire, her cane before her, her old face set, the Duke tall and shut beside her, a dozen near relations and county friends in their good blacks, the rector, Dr. Croom, and, moving among them easy and grave and indispensable, the presiding genius of the occasion, Mr. Aubrey Merrick, who had not the smallest idea, until the door opened, that the plain gray figure his own contempt had exiled to Marchbourne had been summoned back into the one room where he could be undone. He saw her come in, escorted by a footman to a place near the door, a copyist fetched to render a service, and Esther watched the recognition cross his smooth face, and watched him master it, watched him decide, in a breath, that she was still only what she had always been, a nobody with a mad tale that had been crushed once and could be crushed again. It was the error of the clever man who has never once had to think seriously about the person he has stepped on. He did not know she had come with the thing itself. He thought she had come, as before, with only her word. The Duke did not waste ceremony on her. When the first grief of the evening had been got through, and some airs sung. He had her brought forward and addressed her before them all in his cold exact voice, standing by his sister's silent pianoforte, that he had sent for her upon a particular matter, that he understood she had been acquainted with his late sister's music, and had knowledge of a certain last air, unfinished, that was not in the published collection, that if she could play it, or supply it, she would be doing the memory of Lady Rosamund a service, and be recompensed for her trouble, and that the company would hear it. It was as near to a public humiliation as a proud man's grief could devise without meaning cruelty. The dismissed fraud fetched in to render up the last scrap of the glory she had tried to steal, and the dowager's face, watching, was a stone. And Esther Lowell stood in her gray gown before the whole seated family of Wyndholme, in the bright ring of the candles, with the shut pianoforte at her side and her plain box in her hands, and found, as the steadiest sometimes find at the last, that her voice did not shake, and she said what she had come 3 counties and a year of ruin to say. Your grace does me too much honor to send for me at all, and I will answer plainly, as I answered once before in this house and was not believed. There is a last air. I can play it. There is no one else living who can, and I will tell this company why before I am done. But I did not learn it from Lady Rosamund, your grace, though I loved her, and she loved it, and she would, I think, be glad I am the one standing here. I made it as I made the 12 in your book, every note of them, over years, in my own hours, with my own hand, and I did not come tonight to ask this company to take my word for that, for my word is worth nothing in this room against a gentleman's. I came to ask you to let the music answer, which cannot be bought and cannot be flattered, and does not care in the least whether I am a duke's sister or a chandler's lodger. Let me sit down to her ladyship's instrument, and play you 3 things. Then let any soul hear with an ear judge for themselves, and I will abide it. That is all I ask. Not to be believed, to be tested. There was a stir, an outrage half risen. The dowager's cane struck the floor, but the duke, exact even in anger, and held by some splinter of memory of that same steady voice, lifted one hand and said, "Coldly play then, we will hear you, and we will judge." And Esther Lowell sat down at Lady Rosamund's silent pianoforte, and set her plain box upon its lid, and drew out her father's tuning fork, and struck it once against her knee, the one true note singing out over the hushed candle-lit room, the plain honest A that flatters no one, and touched the instrument to it, and found it near enough true, Rosamund's own note kept even in the shut year. And then she began to play. She played the farewell first, the great air they had all wept over for a year, the one they thought they knew, and played it as she alone in the world could, because she had made it, with the phrasing it was born with, and the daring in the bold bar carried through, with a knowing no one there had ever heard in it, so that grown mourners who had sung the thing at 100 pianofortes heard it suddenly for the first time, and did not know why the room had gone so still. And when she came to the famous bar, the passage the whole town wept upon, she stopped, her hands resting, and said quietly into the stillness, "This bar is the most admired thing in the air, and admired for a boldness that is real. But it is printed wrong in your book, not false, but early. It prints a way I wrote this bar once and then bettered, an awkward middle way, where the bold note stands, but stands clumsily, as though whoever set it down had the daring, but not the understanding of it. Hear the printed way." And she played it as the edition had it, and old Frome's very fault stood naked in the air. And now hear the way it truly goes, that I mended after. That is in no copy on this earth, but the one at the bottom of this box, in my own hand, dated 3 winters gone. And she played it right, the true resolution, the same daring made whole and knowing, and the difference was that between a thing half made and a thing finished, and every musical soul in the room heard it, and heard, without yet understanding, that the printed version was the rougher and the earlier, a thing that cannot happen if the print came from an original, and can only happen if it came from a discarded draft. Whoever gave your engraver his copy, your grace, said Esther, still not naming him, her eyes on the keys, did not give him Lady Rosamund's composition, for Lady Rosamund composed nothing. He gave him one particular rough sheet, the single sheet of this air that ever left my hands, into the keeping of the gentleman who taught her 4 years ago and never given back. Your book is the faithful copy of my second thoughts. I have my first thoughts here, and my last, and no one else has either. And then, before the outrage could gather, she played the third thing, the 13th air, the last, her father's. This your book has not got, she said, as her hands found the opening, and your editor cannot give you, and no one in the world can play you but I, because it exists in one copy only, in my hand, and I have never shown it to a living soul, not even to her ladyship, who knew only that it was, and not what it was. I made it the winter my father died, and it is the true end of the whole set, for it answers the 12 as nothing else could. And she played it, into the silent memorial room, the last air made of the deepest grief she had, in the same true voice as the famous 12, and unmistakably of a piece with them. The crown the monument had lacked, and it was so evidently the same hand as all the rest that the case was, for any honest ear, complete before she lifted her fingers from the final chord. The Duke of Wyndholme stood by the instrument with his shut face open at last and terrible, hearing his sister's whole music completed by a chandler's lodger in a grey gown, and beginning at last to understand. It was Merrick who broke it, because a cornered clever man cannot keep still, and because he saw, in that completing chord, his whole golden edifice trembling, and struck, as he had always struck, first and at the weakest thing in reach. He gave the light, incredulous, warm smile that had carried him through 100 drawing-rooms, and stood forward into the candlelight, all easy patient reason, a gentleman regretfully obliged to end a painful scene. "This is very affecting," he said to the room, not to her. "And Miss Lowell plays charmingly. No one disputes she is a capable musician, a copyist indeed of some skill, which is precisely the difficulty. Your Grace forgive me, but I must speak, for her ladyship's sake, since no one else will. This is the very fantasy I warned you of a year ago, grown bolder with a year's brooding. She was your sister's companion and copyist. She had every one of these airs under her hand for 2 years. A clever copyist may learn a whole cycle by heart, may ape a hand, may sit down long after and write out drafts with crossings out contrived to look like labor. Nothing is easier to counterfeit than the appearance of a first attempt, when one already knows the finished thing. As for her 13th, why, it is the oldest trick of the impostor, to produce the one thing that cannot be checked against any record and cry, behold, only the true author could possess this. She has had a year in a garret to compose a 13th air in your sister's style, having studied it to the dregs, and now brings it to a grieving family on the one night their guard is down, and calls a pretty forgery a proof. It is not to be borne, over that poor lady's grave, and I am astonished, your Grace, that we have listened as long as we have. There was no 13th air. I went through every leaf of her ladyship's music case myself. With my own hands, after she died, there were 12 airs fair copied, and no more. The 13th was never anything but a few crossed-out bars in the back of the book, an unfinished nothing she herself had abandoned, and stopped. 1/2 second too late, stopped, hearing it himself as the room had not yet heard it, for Esther Lowell had said, 1 moment since, before them all, that the 13th heir existed in one copy only, in her own hand, shown to no living soul, not even to Lady Rosamund. And how, then, should Mr. Aubrey Merrick, who had never set eyes on that copy, which had never left the bottom of Esther's own box from the day she made it to the hour she carried it into this room, how should he know, to belittle it, that the 13th stood in its author's papers as a few crossed-out bars in the back of the book, unfinished looking, exactly as a foul copy of a private heir looks and a clean, fair copy never does? He had described, to belittle it, the precise appearance of the one page in all the world he swore he had never seen, the very page that lay, that instant, wrapped in oiled silk in the box beneath Esther's hands. He had reached, from the long habit of a man used to being believed on his own say-so, past the safe lie into the guilty truth, and closed his hand on the one fact that only the man who had pored over her stolen drafts could hold. For he had had her drafts, had studied them, had set his golden edition from among them, and in the heat of destroying her he had let his knowledge of them speak. The one man in the room who should have known nothing whatever of Esther Lowell's private foul copies had just corrected the company on the appearance of their most secret page. The silence that came down then was of a wholly different kind from the outrage of a moment before. The silence of a room in which a great many people are, at slightly different speeds, understanding the same thing. Old Doctor Croom the rector was the first, his head coming up, then 2 or 3 of the musical friends, who had heard the 3 states of the farewell and now heard, laid over them. This, and then, terribly, the Dowager, who had loved Rosamund best and believed Merrick hardest, and who turned her old head slowly and looked at the celebrated gentleman by the candles as though a light had gone on in a room she had thought she knew. And the Duke of Wyndholme, who had been trained for a year by this same smooth voice to hear the truth as madness, heard it, in one unguarded half-sentence, undo the whole year's training and convict itself out of its own mouth. And something happened in his face the county had not seen there since before the sick room. He said, very quietly, not taking his eyes from his cousin Aubrey, she said she had shown that page to no one, not 2 minutes since. We all heard her. How do you know what is written in the back of a book you have just sworn to this company you never saw? Merrick had no answer. Of course, there is no answer to a thing like that. He tried, being what he was, to find one. A stammered word about having understood from her ladyship, about supposing, about surely everyone. But it came out in a rush and a stumble, the smoothness gone all to pieces. And the more he groped, the deeper he sank, for every road out of that sentence led back into it. And the Duke, who had spent a year being managed by the beautiful surface of this man, watched the surface crack and saw for the first time the greedy, calculating thing beneath it, and did not need Frome's certificate or the lodged copies or the row of drafts to be certain any longer. Though he would have them all later and check them all, exact to the last, he was certain now, in the way a man is certain when the thing at last shows its own face. He turned from Merrick as from something he did not wish to look at longer, and crossed to where Esther Lowell sat very still at his sister's pianoforte, with her hands folded on her plain box, and the Duke of Wyndholme did the thing the company never afterward forgot, that rearranged in one motion the standing of every soul in the room. He stopped before the chandler's lodger in the gray gown, and bowed to her, the low, exact, deliberate bow a man makes to an equal, absurd and unanswerable across all that gulf of rank, made before his grandmother and his relations and the rector and the servants at the doors, and said, so all of them heard it, Miss Lowell, I called you a fraud in my own study a year ago, and worse, and turned you out of this house without a character, on this man's word, and did not once let you show me the thing you had brought. I was wrong. In a way I do not think I shall ever quite forgive myself, and I will not insult you by asking you to forgive it either. You made my sister's music, the airs the whole world has been weeping over in her name and yours never spoken. And you kept, when you might have burned it and been safe, the proof that could ruin the peace of the 3 proudest people in this county, and you kept it, not to ruin us. For you have named no one and accused no one all this evening, and let even that man hang himself in his own words. You kept it because it was true, and you were bred by someone who could not put a false note into the world to save his own life. I have that right, have I not? And Esther, who did not lie, even now, said only, Lo, my father, your grace. He was a parish organist. He taught me that steel keeps one note and takes no one's part, and that you build on the note that is true and not the note that pleases, though the true note please no one. I could not put the false note into the world. It is not courage, quite, it is only trade. I never learned how to keep a false pitch, and I am too old to learn it now. The rest was swift and quiet, and the Duke of Wyndholme, exact in reparation as he had been exact in grief, made it as complete as such a thing can be made. Mr. Aubrey Merrick was not given the mercy of a scene. He was simply, from that hour, finished, the family's countenance, which was the whole of his living, withdrawn between one breath and the next, required to be gone that night and trouble the county no more, and given to understand, in a short cold interview from which he came out gray, that the engraver's certificate and the sworn drafts of the true composer, lodged where no fire could reach them, would go to every music seller and reviewer in the kingdom the day one whisper against Miss Lowell's name was traced to him. He chose silence, as such men do, and he went out of Wyndholme that night, and out of this story, and was heard of afterward only as a man whose great reputation had unaccountably faded, who was somehow not quite asked any longer, and who died abroad in the end, small and forgotten, which is the natural fate of a taste that has nothing true beneath it. The memorial edition the Duke recalled, and had made again, at his own charge under its right name at last, the heirs of Esther Lowell, but with a dedication of Esther's own asking on the front, that surprised the whole town, and told those who could read it everything about the woman who wrote it, to the memory of Lady Rosamund Wyndholme, who loved these airs and gave them their first voice, from her friend who made them. For Esther would not, even vindicated, let one shadow fall on the friend she had loved. She made the world understand, in that one gilt line, that Rosamund had stolen nothing and claimed nothing, had only been a warm, generous young woman who loved her companion's music and played it with tears in her eyes, and that the theft had been the living gentleman's and not the dead lady's, so that Rosamund's memory came out of the whole business not stained, but sweetened, remembered now as the friend who had first loved a hidden genius, the exact truth and the kindest, which only Esther had cared enough to save. And the Dowager, the proud old lady who had cast her off without a character, who had believed the smooth lie hardest because she wished it truest, did a thing, in the days that followed, that cost her more than the young could know, because under all the pride she was, at bottom, a just woman who had loved rightly and been deceived. She sent for Esther Lowell, And when the gray figure stood before her again in the room where she had been dismissed, the old lady looked at her a long moment, and said, with the terrible plainness of the very old and the effort of a lifetime's pride bending, "I did you a great wrong in this room, Miss Lowell, and I have been made to know it, and I find I am not too old to be ashamed, which I had thought I was. I will not ask your pardon, for it is not a thing that ought to be made easy by the asking. I will only say that my granddaughter loved you, and had, I see now, a better eye for worth than her grandmother, who could see nothing but the gray gown, and that this house owes you what it can never pay, and will spend some pains trying. You will not be turned out of Wyndholme again while I live in it. It was not an embrace. Such women do not embrace. But it was the whole surrender of a proud heart to a truth it had fought, and Esther, generous where she had been given no cause to be, took the old cold hand and pressed it, and said only that her ladyship's granddaughter had been the one friend of her life, and that to be let stay in the house Rosamund had loved was more than payment, and the two women who had loved the same lost young lady were, from that hour, at a kind of grave peace. As for the Duke, but you will have seen where that was going long before this. For the great man who learns at last to see the woman he overlooked does not, in such stories, merely thank her and let her go. He could not, having found her, unfind her, and the finding had gone very deep. For he was a man who valued truth above every other thing, having been so nearly destroyed by a lie. And here was a woman who had chosen the true note over her own safety with a fire 4 feet off and no soul in the world to know or reward it. He kept her at Wyndholme first on the honest pretext of her music. She was to set the instruments right and complete the true edition, and let the shut house have its sound again, and the pretext lasted about as long as such pretexts do. For the great silent house that had made no sound for 2 years, because its master could not bear to hear his sister in it, learned to bear music again by the only road grief ever takes back to joy, which is through a new love laid gently over the old, and not replacing it, and it was Esther. Evening after evening at Rosamund's pianoforte, with her father's fork on the lid, playing the airs under their right name at last, who taught the frozen Duke that his sister's music was not lost to him, but given back doubled, since here was the living hand that had made it, and would make more. He fell in love with her the way such a man falls, slowly and wholly, and against his long habit of shutness, not with her face, though he came to think the grave gray face the dearest in the world, but with the thing his whole nature was built to prize, the plain, unbought truth of her, the note that would not flatter him and never once tried. And when at last, one evening among the small, honest voices of the tuned instruments, he asked her plainly to stay at Wyndholme, not as its music keeper, but as its mistress, to build the rest of both their lives on the true note and not the pleasing one, Esther Lowell, who had opened every locked thing at Wyndholme but the one behind her own ribs, and found even that at last, standing open, set down her father's tuning fork, and looked at him with her father's level eyes, and gave him her answer plainly, because plainness was the only dialect she had ever kept. "Yes," she said, "and you may test it against me every day of your life, your grace, as you tested the airs, and you will find it rings true. For I was bred by a man who never in his days sounded a false note to please a customer, and I do not know how to give you a false pitch, and I never learned it, and now I never shall." They were married before the spring, quietly from the court. By Dr. Croom, and old Elias Frome was fetched up from Marchbourne in the Duke's own carriage to see his copyist made a duchess, and grumbled all the way home that the world had gone soft in the head, and was pleased as could be the whole while, and the white-faced Alice cried, and the county offered a duke married to a chandler's lodger, and no scandal it could prove, said everything that might be looked for, Behind its fans, a scheming creature, a designing nobody who had played on his Grace's grief, and then had to sit and watch, across the years, the one spectacle gossip has no answer to. Two quiet people, visibly, durably, unfashionably happy. The new Duchess of Wyndholme never played the great lady and never once tried. She kept her father's plain steel tuning fork on the pianoforte's lid to the end of her days, and struck it before she played, every time, so the house should build on the true note. She opened the shut music room for good, and filled the silent house with sound again, her own and the old master's, and, in time, her pupils'. For she took, to the county's scandal, and then to its pride, any young person of the parish or the tenantry with an ear and a wish to learn, and taught them for nothing, saying her father had taught for a shilling the quarter and gone hungry for it and never turned one away, and that she saw no reason a duchess should be less honest than a poor organist, nor music be kept only for the great who could pay. And she wrote, openly now, under her own name, air after air across the long good years, but it was always said, by those who knew music, that she never bettered the 13th, her father's air, the one she had carried unshown at the bottom of a box through a year of ruin and would not burn, and that when, at the memorial concerts, Wyndholme came to give each winter for the county's poor, the Duchess sat down at the last and played that air under her own hand, with the old Duke listening from the shadows with his eyes shut and the whole hall silent. There was not a soul in the place, gentle or simple, who did not feel they were hearing the truest thing in the world, a true note kept faith with at cost, and sounded at last where all the world could hear it. They had, together, better than 30 years, and the man the county had thought frozen for life grew warm so gradually and so wholly that the young who came after could never be made to credit the old repute of him. To the end of his days, when any person was pressed upon him on the strength of a fine manner or a fashionable name or a plausible warm tongue, he would say only that he had learned his own way of valuing people long ago, at a high price, from two teachers, from a charming gentleman who had wrapped a theft in beautiful words and been believed by everyone, himself the loudest, for a year, and from an organist's daughter who had taught him that you must never take a thing's word for its own worth, since the false note and the true note are equally easy to swear to, and only the ear that has nothing to gain can tell them apart. You must sound it, and listen, and hear whether it rings true, when ringing true has been made to cost. His Duchess outlived him by some years, and struck the plain steel fork before she played, until her hand could strike it no more. And when she followed him, the county, which had once had every opinion of the great cold Duke, and none whatever of the grey companion he married, came in from 30 miles about, tenants and tradesmen, and the taught-for-nothing grown grey now with families of their own, and stood 3 deep along the road from the court to the church in a March wind, for the organist's daughter. It was not for her rank the county had rank to spare. It was that in 35 years no soul in that country, gentle or simple, had ever once had from Esther, Duchess of Wyndholme, a note that was not true, and it made hers the truest air in the county. There is a thing known to every honest music copyist, that a song will answer, in the end, to the hand that made it, and to no other. And at Wyndholme they tell the story still of the winter the great house made no music, and the plain woman who gave it back its own true voice. A charming, celebrated, universally trusted gentleman took a nobody's music and printed it under a dead lady's name and his own, and wept his tears over it, and was believed against all comers, as charming gentlemen are, and every art he used, the beautiful lie, the borrowed grief, the true story turned neatly inside out, the great family's love of their dead, enlisted to crush the truth-teller, was defeated in the end, not by a magistrate and not by a cleverer schemer, but by a quiet keeper of music who knew that a song cannot be argued into a hand that did not make it, and who, holding at the bottom of a plain box the one proof that could cost her everything, would not burn it to be safe, because she had been taught by a poor honest man that you build on the note that is true and not, the note that pleases. She was not saved by beauty, for she had little to spare, nor by fortune, for she had none, nor by anyone's belief in her word, for no one in that house believed it. She was saved by the plainest thing in the world, which is that the truth keeps its own pitch whether or not a single soul is listening. And whenever, long after, a fine name was believed against a plain one, or an honest woman's work was called a schemer's forgery, or a clever man forgot that somebody, somewhere, quietly keeps the true note, someone in that county would tell of the gray companion who would not sound a false air to save her own life, and it made hers the truest air in the county. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from and what this story made you feel. And if it moved you, consider subscribing softly so you won't miss the next one.